My name is Celeste. I'm 34, and I thought I knew what family betrayal looked like until Thanksgiving dinner 2023. Watching my children ages 7 and 9 stand hungry in the corner while my sister Vivian's kids devoured the feast our grandmother prepared was the moment everything crystallized. The same grandmother who raised us both, who preached about blood being thicker than water, looked me dead in the eye and said my kids could wait for leftovers. What I discovered that night about decades of deliberate favoritism, stolen inheritances, and carefully orchestrated lies would destroy our family forever. But before we dive into how I methodically dismantled the empire of deceit my family built on my back, I need to know where you're watching from. Are you Team Justice or Team Forgiveness? Hit that like button if you've ever felt like the family scapegoat, and subscribe, because this revenge story has layers that'll make your head spin. Trust me, you won't see this ending coming. Growing up, I always knew Vivian was the golden child, but I convinced myself it was normal sibling dynamics. She was 2 years older, more outgoing, and seemed to effortlessly charm everyone around her. What I didn't realize was how carefully orchestrated this favoritism actually was, or how it would shape the next 3 decades of my life. Our parents died in a car accident when I was 16 and Vivian was 18. Grandmother Eleanor became our guardian, and that's when the real favoritism began. Vivian got the bigger bedroom, the newer car, and somehow always had money for college expenses, while I worked 3 part-time jobs to afford community college. When I questioned these discrepancies, Grandmother would sigh and explain that Vivian was going through a harder time adjusting, or that she needed more support right now. I bought into every excuse because I loved my grandmother and trusted her judgment. She was a pillar of our small Tennessee community, known for her charity work and wisdom. If Eleanor Morrison said something, people listened. If she believed Vivian deserved more, then surely she must be right. The pattern continued into adulthood. When Vivian got pregnant at 22 with her first child, Grandmother immediately offered her the guest house on the property rent-free. When I got pregnant at 24, she suggested I might want to find my own place to start building independence. Vivian's children became the center of every family gathering, while mine were often treated as afterthoughts. My ex-husband David noticed it before I did. During our marriage, he'd point out how differently my kids were treated compared to Vivian's, but I'd defend my family. They're just closer to Vivian, I'd say. She lives right there on the property. I was so conditioned to accept less that I couldn't see the deliberate nature of the exclusion. The financial disparities were subtle, but constant. Vivian's kids got expensive birthday gifts, while mine received modest presents. When her son needed braces, Grandmother paid the $4,000 bill without hesitation. When my daughter needed the same treatment, I was told it might be good for me to learn financial responsibility by handling it myself. Family vacations became another source of pain. Grandmother would plan elaborate trips to Disney World or beach resorts, always with the assumption that Vivian's family would come along. I'd only hear about these plans secondhand, usually when Vivian would casually mention them in conversation. If I expressed interest in joining, there were always reasons why it wouldn't work. Not enough room in the rental house, too expensive to book additional accommodations, or simply that the plans were already finalized. The emotional manipulation was masterful. Whenever I showed signs of questioning the treatment, Grandmother would lavish me with temporary attention and affection, just enough to keep me from pulling away completely. She'd take me shopping or cook my favorite meal, all while reminding me how lucky I was to have such a loving family who only wanted what was best for everyone. What hurt most was watching my children internalize their second-class status. My daughter Aria would ask why Grandmother bought her cousin a new bike, but not her. My son Mason would wonder why he couldn't sleep over at the big house like his cousins did every weekend. I'd make excuses trying to protect their feelings, while my own heart broke watching them accept being treated as less worthy. The holiday traditions particularly stung. Christmas morning was always at grandmother's house, but Vivian's children opened their elaborate pile of gifts first, while mine waited with their smaller, clearly less expensive presents. Easter egg hunts were designed around Vivian's kids' ages and abilities. Even birthday parties somehow became showcases for Vivian's family, with my children feeling like guests at their own celebrations. I started keeping a mental tally of the inequities, though I told myself I was being petty. The expensive summer camps for Vivian's kids versus the character-building part-time jobs suggested for mine. The college funds that somehow materialized for her children while I was told to teach mine about earning their way. The family photos displayed prominently throughout grandmother's house, where Vivian's family dominated the frames while pictures of my children were relegated to less prominent locations. The breaking point should have come years earlier, but it took that Thanksgiving dinner to finally shatter my willful blindness. Thanksgiving 2023 started like every other family gathering, with me arriving early to help prepare while Vivian showed up fashionably late with her perfectly dressed children. I'd spent hours making my grandmother's famous stuffing recipe and sweet potato casserole, the same dishes I'd been assigned for the past 15 years. Vivian, as always, was responsible for bringing wine and looking beautiful. My children, Aria and Mason, were excited. They'd been talking about Thanksgiving dinner for weeks, especially the turkey and grandmother's legendary pecan pie. We'd had a rough year financially after my divorce was finalized, and I'd been working extra shifts at the hospital, where I worked as a nurse to make ends meet. This family dinner represented more than just food. It was comfort, tradition, and belonging. But the moment we walked into grandmother's dining room, I noticed something different. The table was set for 8 people, not the usual 12. When I asked about it, grandmother waved dismissively and said we'd make it work. What I didn't understand then was that the table had been deliberately set to accommodate Vivian's family of 5 and grandmother, with only 2 seats remaining for my family of 3. The first red flag came during cocktail hour. Vivian's children were served appetizers on real china plates, while my kids were handed paper napkins with crackers. When Mason asked for more cheese, he was told to wait until dinner, while Vivian's youngest son was handed another full plate without question. But the real shock came when we sat down to eat. Grandmother announced that we'd be serving the children first, which seemed normal enough. Then she began calling names. Rebecca, come get your plate. Tyler, you're next. Sarah, don't forget the gravy. All of Vivian's children were served heaping portions of turkey stuffing, mashed potatoes, and vegetables. Their plates were piled high with the best cuts of meat and generous helpings of every side dish. Then came the moment that's burned into my memory forever. My children stood up expectantly when grandmother finished serving Vivian's kids, but she looked at them with barely concealed irritation and said, Aria and Mason, you'll need to wait. We need to make sure there's enough food for everyone else first. I felt the blood drain from my face. Excuse me, well dear, we don't want to run short. The children can share what's left after the adults are served. I looked at the serving dishes, still heavy with food. There was clearly enough for everyone to have generous portions. This wasn't about scarcity. This was about hierarchy. My children were being deliberately placed at the bottom of the family pecking order, and it was being done openly, without shame or apology. Vivian said nothing. She sat there cutting her turkey, occasionally glancing at her children to make sure they had everything they needed, completely ignoring the fact that my kids were standing there empty-handed and confused. There's plenty of food, I said, my voice carefully controlled. I can see full serving dishes from here. Grandmother's tone became sharp. Celeste, I've been hosting Thanksgiving dinners since before you were born. I think I know how to manage portions. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Vivian's children eating. My kids stood there 8 and 10 years old watching their cousins enjoy the feast while they waited for permission to eat in their own family's home. The humiliation wasn't just about the food, it was about what this moment represented. They were being taught their place in the family hierarchy, and that place was at the bottom. But what happened next revealed the true depth of the cruelty. After the adults were served, portions that were noticeably smaller than what Vivian's children had received, grandmother announced that there might not be enough turkey left for seconds. She suggested that Arya and Mason could share a plate and maybe fill up on bread and vegetables. I watched my daughter's face crumble as she realized she wasn't just getting less food, she was expected to be grateful for scraps. Mason tried to be brave, but I could see his confusion and hurt. They couldn't understand why their cousins got full plates while they were expected to split leftovers. That's when something inside me snapped. Not the explosive, dramatic kind of breaking point you see in movies, but the quiet, crystalline moment when everything becomes clear. This wasn't about a difficult Thanksgiving or a momentary oversight. This was the culmination of decades of systematic favoritism, and my children were paying the price for my willingness to accept less. I stood up slowly, my hands trembling with anger I'd suppressed for years. "Get your coats," I told my children. "We're leaving." Grandmother looked genuinely shocked. "Leaving? But we haven't had dessert yet." "No," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "We're done here." As we gathered our things, I heard Vivian whisper something to her oldest daughter about Aunt Celeste being dramatic again. That comment meant to be heard was the final straw. I turned back to face the table where my family sat, with their full plates and satisfied expressions, and I made a promise to myself this would never happen again. The drive home from that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner was silent, except for my children's sniffles. They didn't understand why we left, why their grandmother had treated them differently, or why their cousins got to eat while they didn't. I promised them McDonald's for dinner and that we'd have our own celebration at home, but inside, I was seething with a clarity I'd never experienced before. That night, after I'd tucked Arya and Mason into bed with full stomachs and reassurances that they'd done nothing wrong, I sat at my kitchen table and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out exactly how deep this favoritism ran, and I was going to document every instance of the financial and emotional inequality I'd been blind to for so long. I started with the obvious disparities. Using my nursing background in detailed record keeping, I created a spreadsheet tracking every gift expense and financial support I could remember from the past 5 years. The numbers were staggering. Vivian's children had received approximately $47, 0 inches, gifts, educational expenses, and support from grandmother during that period. My children had received less than $8, 000. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to dig deeper into our family's financial history. I'd always assumed grandmother was simply generous with Vivian because she was the older grandchild, or because she lived closer. What I discovered was far more sinister. During my lunch break at the hospital 3 days after Thanksgiving, I called our family lawyer, Mr. Patterson, who had handled our parents' estate when they died. I told him I needed copies of the estate documents for my own records. What he told me made my blood run cold. "Actually, Celeste, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. When you turn 35 next month, there are some provisions in your parents' will that activate. You should probably come in to discuss them." I'd never heard about any provisions. As far as I knew, everything had been left to grandmother to distribute as she saw fit. But according to Mr. Patterson, there was much more to the story. The meeting that Friday revealed the scope of the deception that had shaped my entire adult life. My parents had left a substantial estate, nearly $800, 0 inches total assets including life insurance policies, investments, and the value of the family home. But instead of leaving everything to grandmother outright, they'd created a complex trust with very specific instructions. The trust was designed to provide for both Vivian and me equally, with funds designated for education, housing assistance, and eventually a substantial inheritance when we each turned 35. Grandmother had been named as the trustee responsible for managing the money, according to our parents' detailed wishes. Your grandmother has been creative in her interpretation of the trust's provisions, Mr. Patterson said, carefully. The educational expenses for Vivian's children, the housing assistance, even some of the general support, much of that should have been available to you as well. I felt physically sick as he explained how the trust actually worked. The money I thought was grandmother's generosity toward Vivian was actually coming from our parents' estate, money that was supposed to benefit both families equally. For 18 years, I'd been watching my inheritance get spent on my sister's family while being told I needed to be more independent and self-sufficient. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. Mr. Patterson pulled out a sealed envelope with my name on it, written in my mother's handwriting. Your parents left specific letters for each of you to be opened when you turned 35. This was meant to explain their reasoning behind the trust structure. My hands shook as I opened the letter. My mother's familiar handwriting filled 3 pages with words that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family dynamic. My dearest Celeste, if you're reading this, you've reached your 35th birthday, and hopefully have begun to understand the true nature of the trust we've established. We've watched Vivian throughout her childhood and teenage years, and while we love her deeply, we're concerned about her sense of entitlement and her tendency to take advantage of generosity without developing self-reliance. We've structured this trust to provide for both of you, but with protections in place to ensure that you, our more responsible and hardworking daughter, receive your fair share. We've observed how Vivian often manipulates situations to her advantage, and we worry that without careful oversight, she might find ways to claim more than her portion. We've appointed Mother as trustee because we trust her judgment, but we've also included very specific provisions to protect your interests. By age 35, you should receive $300,000 as your inheritance, plus compensation for any educational or housing support that was provided to Vivian but not to you. The letter went on to detail their observations about our different personalities and their hopes that the trust structure would force Vivian to develop more responsibility while ensuring I wasn't penalized for being the more independent sister. They'd even included provisions for equal treatment of grandchildren, with specific amounts designated for education and special occasions. As I sat in Mr. Patterson's office reading my dead mother's words, I realized that every financial struggle I'd faced, every time I'd been told to handle expenses on my own while watching Vivian receive help, every moment I'd felt like the family scapegoat, it had all been a deliberate betrayal by the one person I'd trusted most. Grandmother hadn't just been playing favorites. She'd been systematically stealing from my children's future while convincing me that I was being selfish for even noticing the inequality. How much of my inheritance has been spent? I asked Mr. Patterson, dreading the answer. He consulted his files. Based on the expenditures I've been asked to approve, approximately $240,000 of your designated funds have been used for expenses that should have been charged to Vivian's portion of the trust. The room started spinning. Not only had my grandmother been stealing from me for nearly 2 decades, but she'd been using my own parents' money to elevate Vivian's family while systematically diminishing mine. Every time I'd struggled to pay for my children's needs while watching their cousins receive expensive gifts and opportunities, I'd been denied access to money my parents had specifically set aside for exactly those purposes. But there was more. Mr. Patterson explained that the trust included provisions for what would happen if the trustee was found to be in breach of fiduciary duty. All remaining assets would be immediately transferred to the beneficiaries, and the trustee could be held personally liable for any misappropriated funds. I walked out of that office with copies of every document, a clear understanding of exactly how much had been stolen from my family, and a plan for justice that would make that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner look like a minor inconvenience. The war was about to begin, and I finally had the ammunition I needed to win it. But first, I want to pause here and ask you something. How many of you have felt that gut feeling that something wasn't fair in your family, but you convinced yourself you were just being sensitive? Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when your instincts were telling you something that everyone else was denying. And if this story is resonating with you so far, smash that like button, because we're just getting to the good part. The evidence I'm about to uncover will blow your mind, and the revenge I planned will leave you speechless. Don't go anywhere. This is where everything changes. Armed with the devastating truth about our parents' trust, I spent the next 2 weeks methodically building an ironclad case against my grandmother. As a nurse, I was accustomed to detailed documentation and careful observation. Skills that would serve me well in exposing 18 years of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. My first step was creating a comprehensive timeline of every financial transaction I could verify. I requested bank statements from the trust account, educational records, showing payments made for various children and receipts for major purchases. The paper trail was extensive, and it told a story of systematic favoritism that went far beyond what I'd originally suspected. The trust documents revealed that grandmother had been required to provide annual reports to Mr. Patterson detailing how funds were distributed, but she'd been submitting vague summaries that obscured the true nature of the spending. When I compared her reports to the actual receipts and bank records, the discrepancies were staggering. For example, in 2019, grandmother reported spending $15,000 on educational expenses for grandchildren. What she didn't specify was that $12,000 of that went to a private SAT prep course and summer academic camp for Vivian's oldest daughter, while my children received nothing. The remaining $3,000 was listed as my portion, but when I tracked down the actual expense, it turned out to be reimbursement for school supplies and uniforms I'd already purchased myself. The housing assistance was even more egregious. Vivian's family had been living rent-free in the guest house for 12 years, a benefit valued at approximately $96,000 based on local rental rates. According to the trust documents, both families were supposed to receive equal housing support. Instead, I'd been struggling with mortgage payments on my modest home, while my parents' money subsidized my sister's family's comfortable lifestyle. But the most damaging evidence came from grandmother's own records. As trustee, she was required to keep detailed files of all decisions and communications related to the trust. What I found in those files was a clear pattern of deliberate deception. In a 2018 email to Mr. Patterson, grandmother wrote, "Celeste continues to be financially irresponsible. I believe it's better for her character development if she handles her children's school expenses independently, rather than relying on trust funds." Yet that same year, she'd approved $8,000 for Vivian's son's private music lessons and summer camp. Another email from 2020 was even more revealing. Vivian's children show such promise academically. I think it's worth investing more in their educational opportunities, even if it means temporarily reducing allocations for other purposes. The other purposes turned out to be my children's college fund. As I dug deeper, I discovered that grandmother had been actively undermining my financial stability while propping up Vivian's family. When I'd applied for financial aid for Aria's school activities, the applications showed family assets that included my portion of the trust, money I'd never had access to, but that somehow counted against my need-based aid eligibility. The emotional manipulation was documented too. I found saved text messages between grandmother and Vivian, discussing how to handle my complaints about fairness. In one exchange, Vivian suggested that grandmother should give me a little something whenever I seemed upset, just enough to keep her from making a scene. The cruelest discovery was a group text from last Christmas, where grandmother and Vivian coordinated their gift-giving strategy. "Make sure Celeste's kids get something nice too," grandmother had written, "but nothing that overshadows what Rebecca and Tyler are getting. We don't want drama on Christmas morning." Reading these messages felt like being punched in the stomach repeatedly. They'd been managing my emotions and my children's disappointment like it was a game, calculating exactly how little they could give, while maintaining the illusion of family unity. I also reached out to other family members who might have witnessed the favoritism over the years. My cousin Jennifer, who lived across the country but visited occasionally, confirmed what I'd suspected. "I always wondered why Vivian's kids seemed to get so much more," she told me over the phone. "But when I asked Aunt Eleanor about it, she said you preferred to handle things independently." Even our elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen had noticed the disparity. "I used to see your grandmother taking Vivian's children on shopping trips and to restaurants," she told me when I ran into her at the grocery store. "I always wondered why your little ones weren't included. I thought maybe they were sick or something." The financial analysis was devastating but clear. Over 18 years, my children had been denied approximately $180, 0 inches, educational support, extracurricular activities, gifts, and opportunities that had been freely given to their cousins. The money hadn't disappeared. It had been redirected to enhance Vivian's family's lifestyle, while mine struggled. But beyond the money was the emotional cost. I'd spent years questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was being too sensitive or selfish for noticing the inequality. I'd absorbed the message that my children were somehow less deserving, less worthy of investment and attention. The psychological damage was immeasurable. As I compiled evidence, I also began documenting the current situation. I took photos of the lavish Christmas gifts piled under grandmother's tree for Vivian's children compared to the modest presents for mine. I saved screenshots of social media posts showing expensive family vacations my children were never invited to join. I kept records of every family gathering where my kids were treated as second-class citizens. The pattern was unmistakable and legally actionable. Grandmother had systematically violated her fiduciary duty as trustee, misappropriated funds designated for my family, and caused measurable financial harm through 18 years of favoritism disguised as thoughtful gift-giving. By mid-December, I had assembled a file that was both heartbreaking and legally devastating. The evidence was overwhelming, the financial damage was precisely calculated, and the betrayal was documented in their own words. It was time to take action. On December 20th, exactly 1 month after that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner, I made copies of every document, every bank statement, and every damning text message I'd collected. I arranged for my children to spend the day with my ex-husband David, knowing that what I was about to do would likely explode our family permanently. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. I drove to grandmother's house on a cold Tuesday morning, knowing that Vivian would be there for their weekly coffee date, a tradition I'd never been invited to join, though I now understood it had probably been a strategy session, disguised as family bonding. I knocked on the front door of the house, where I'd grown up carrying a manila folder that contained 18 years of evidence. When grandmother opened the door, her face lit up with the same warm smile that had masked decades of manipulation. "Celeste, what a lovely surprise. Vivian and I were just having coffee. Come in, come in." I followed her into the familiar living room where Vivian sat, curled up on the sofa with her favorite mug, looking perfectly comfortable in the space that had always felt more like hers than mine. She glanced up when I entered, her expression shifting from casual indifference to mild concern when she saw the folder in my hands. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "All of us." About the trust. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Grandmother's welcoming smile faltered, and Vivian set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. They exchanged a quick glance that confirmed what I'd suspected. They both knew exactly what conversation we were about to have. "What about the trust, dear grandmother?" asked, her tone carefully neutral. I opened the folder and pulled out copies of the original trust documents, placing them on the coffee table between us. "I know about the $800,000. I know about the equal distributions that were supposed to happen. I know about the educational funds and the housing assistance and the inheritance I'm supposed to receive next month." Vivian's face went pale. "Celeste, I think there might be some misunderstanding." "No," I interrupted, my voice cutting through her attempt at deflection. "There's no misunderstanding. I have 18 years of bank records, email communications, and documentation showing how you two have systematically stolen from my children, while convincing me I was selfish for even noticing." I spread out the evidence methodically, like a prosecutor presenting a case. Bank statements showing massive expenditures for Vivian's family charged to my portion of the trust. Text messages discussing how to manage my emotions while continuing the favoritism. Educational records showing $47,000 spent on Vivian's children versus $8,000 on mine. Grandmother sank into her chair, her face aging 10 years in 10 seconds. "You don't understand the whole situation." "Then explain it to me," I said, pulling out the letter from my mother. "Explain how this letter, where my parents specifically protected my interests and warned about Vivian's sense of entitlement, somehow justified giving her family $240,000 of my inheritance." Reading my mother's words aloud was devastating for all of us, but for different reasons. For me, it was validation that my parents had seen what I'd been too blind to recognize. For grandmother and Vivian, it was the moment they realized their carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. Vivian tried to mount a defense. "Mom and Dad always said we should help each other as family, with your own money," I shot back. "Not with mine. Not with my children's college funds and future opportunities." The confrontation that followed was 18 years of suppressed anger finally finding its voice. Grandmother attempted to justify her decisions by claiming she'd been protecting me from becoming dependent, while Vivian oscillated between denial and tearful apologies that rang hollow given the evidence of deliberate planning. But the most shocking revelation came when I confronted them about the Thanksgiving dinner that had started this investigation. "That dinner wasn't spontaneous," I said, pulling out text messages I'd discovered. "You planned it. You set the table for 8 people because you never intended my children to be treated equally." Grandmother's defense finally crumbled. "They get fed at your house. Vivian's children needed what? To be taught that they're more important than their cousins. To learn that some family members matter more than others." The tears came then, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone who'd been caught and was facing consequences for the first time. Vivian tried to argue that she'd never asked for special treatment, but the text messages proved otherwise. She'd actively participated in discussions about how to maintain the favoritism while avoiding family conflict. "I trusted you," I told grandmother, my voice breaking, despite my resolve to stay strong. "I defended you to my ex-husband when he said you were playing favorites. I made excuses to my children when they asked why their cousins got more. I blamed myself for not being good enough, successful enough, worthy enough. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Vivian crying and grandmother's labored breathing. They both understood that this wasn't just about money. It was about decades of psychological manipulation that had damaged my self-worth and my children's sense of belonging in their own family. Finally, I delivered the ultimatum that would change everything. "I'm giving you one chance to make this right," I said, gathering up the documents. "You have until January 1st to transfer my full inheritance, plus compensation for the money that was misappropriated, plus interest. Mr. Patterson has all the calculations. If the money isn't transferred by then, I'm filing a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, and I'm making sure everyone in this family and this community knows exactly what you've done." Vivian gasped. "You can't be serious. This would destroy our family." I looked at her with cold clarity. "You already destroyed our family. I'm just refusing to pretend otherwise anymore." As I walked toward the door, grandmother made one last desperate attempt at manipulation. "Your parents wouldn't want this kind of conflict. They'd want us to work together as a family." I turned back to face her one final time. "My parents left specific instructions in that trust to prevent exactly what you've done. They saw through both of you 18 years ago, and they tried to protect me. You decided their wishes didn't matter. The drive home was surreal. I'd just declared war on the only family I had left, but for the first time in my adult life, I felt truly free. The gaslighting was over. The favoritism was exposed. The years of questioning my own perceptions had ended. That night, I sat down with Aria and Mason and had the hardest conversation of my parenting life. I explained in age-appropriate terms that there had been unfairness in our family that I was working to fix. I told them they were loved, valued, and deserving of the same treatment as anyone else. "Are we going to see Grandma Eleanor anymore?" Aria asked. "Not until she learns how to treat all her grandchildren fairly," I replied. The countdown to January 1st had begun, and I was prepared for whatever came next. The week between Christmas and New Year's was the longest of my life. I'd laid down an ultimatum that would either restore some semblance of justice to my family or force me to follow through on legal action that would expose decades of betrayal to our entire community. Either way, there was no going back to the old dynamic where I accepted scraps and convinced myself I was being unreasonable. On December 28th, I received a call from Mr. Patterson. "Celeste, your grandmother has requested an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. She wants to discuss the trust situation." I arrived at his office to find grandmother and Vivian already there, both looking like they'd aged years in the past week. Grandmother's usual composed demeanor was nowhere to be found, and Vivian looked like she'd been crying for days. "Celeste, Mr. Patterson began, your grandmother has agreed to transfer your full inheritance amount plus compensatory damages for the misappropriated funds. The total comes to $387,000, which includes interest calculated from the dates of the original violations." I felt a surge of vindication mixed with sadness. After 18 years, justice was finally being served, but it had come at the cost of destroying relationships that could never be repaired. Grandmother spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. "I want you to know that I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. Vivian needed more help, and you always seemed so capable, so independent. What you thought was best involved stealing from my children and lying to me for 18 years, I replied. "Your intentions don't change the damage you caused." Vivian finally found her voice. "I never meant for it to go this far. I never realized how much." "You never realized because you never asked," I interrupted. "You were comfortable with the benefits, so you never questioned where they came from or whether they were fair." The money transfer happened that afternoon. After nearly 2 decades of financial struggle while watching my sister's family prosper, I finally had access to the inheritance my parents had intended for me all along. But more importantly, I had validation that my perceptions hadn't been wrong, my feelings hadn't been unreasonable, and my children's disappointment hadn't been unjustified. The ripple effects throughout our extended family were immediate and dramatic. When the news of the trust violations spread, other relatives began asking questions about their own experiences with grandmother's generosity. My cousin Jennifer called to tell me she'd always suspected something wasn't right, but had been afraid to speak up. Our Aunt Margaret admitted she'd noticed the favoritism, but had assumed it was none of her business. But the most satisfying moment came 3 weeks later when I received an unexpected visitor. Rebecca, Vivian's oldest daughter who was now 19, came to my house alone. She sat at my kitchen table and told me something that validated every instinct I'd ever had about the family dynamic. "I always knew it wasn't fair," she said quietly. "The way Grandma treated your kids versus how she treated us. I used to ask my mom about it when I was younger, and she'd just say, 'You preferred to handle things differently.'" She went on to explain how uncomfortable the favoritism had made her and her siblings feel, especially as they got older and could better understand the implications. "That Thanksgiving dinner was awful," she admitted. "I wanted to give Aria and Mason my food, but Mom gave me a look that told me to stay quiet." Hearing this from one of Vivian's own children was both heartbreaking and healing. It confirmed that the inequality had been obvious to everyone, including the children who had benefited from it. The damage wasn't just to my family. It had affected the entire next generation's understanding of fairness and family relationships. With my inheritance finally in hand, I was able to do things for my children that had been impossible before. I set up college funds that matched what their cousins had received. I enrolled them in the music lessons and summer camps they'd always wanted but we couldn't afford. Most importantly, I was able to move us into a beautiful home in a better school district, giving them opportunities that had been systematically denied for years. The best part wasn't the material improvements, though. It was watching my children's confidence grow as they realized they were worthy of investment and attention. Aria started taking violin lessons and discovered she had real talent. Mason joined a robotics club that sparked his interest in engineering. For the first time, they weren't looking at their cousins' opportunities and wondering why they couldn't have the same things. Grandmother made several attempts to reconcile in the months that followed, but her apologies always came with justifications that showed she still didn't understand the depth of the betrayal. She'd say things like, "I was trying to help Vivian because she needed it more," or, "I thought you were strong enough to handle independence." She never seemed to grasp that the issue wasn't just the money. It was the systematic emotional manipulation and the way she'd made my children feel less valued. Vivian's attempts at reconciliation were even more frustrating. She wanted to move forward as family without acknowledging her active participation in the favoritism. She'd suggest family dinners where we could put this behind us, as if 18 years of inequality could be erased with a single meal. She seemed genuinely confused by my refusal to pretend that nothing had happened. The legal resolution gave me something more valuable than money. It gave me proof that I hadn't been imagining things. For years, I'd questioned my own perceptions and wondered if I was being too sensitive. Having documentation of the systematic favoritism validated every uncomfortable feeling I'd ever had about family gatherings and gift exchanges. 6 months after that terrible Thanksgiving dinner, I hosted my own celebration. I invited the family members who had supported me through the legal process, along with friends who had become like family. My children were the center of attention, not afterthoughts waiting for scraps. They helped plan the menu they served themselves first, and they never had to wonder if they were as important as anyone else at the table. As I watched Aria and Mason laughing with their friends, secure in their own worth and surrounded by people who valued them, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting back at people who wronged you. Sometimes it's about building a life so good that their betrayal becomes irrelevant. The trust fund violation taught me that blood doesn't automatically create loyalty, and shared DNA doesn't guarantee fair treatment. But it also taught me that standing up for yourself and your children, even when it's painful and complicated, is sometimes the most loving thing you can do. My family told my sister's kids to eat first and told my kids to wait for the crumbs. In the end, we got the whole feast. And we didn't have to share it with people who thought we didn't deserve it. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced favoritism in your family that made you question your own worth? Have you had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your children from unfair treatment? Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think I was right to pursue justice, even though it destroyed family relationships? Or should I have found a way to forgive and move forward for the sake of family unity? Hit that like button if you believe that standing up for yourself and your children is always worth it, even when it means burning bridges with people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. And please subscribe for more stories about family drama, justice served, and the complicated choices we make when the people who should protect us become the ones we need protection from. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that their perceptions matter, their children deserve equal treatment, and sometimes the family you choose ends up being better than the family you're born into. Thank you for listening to my story, and for all your support in the comments. Remember, trust your instincts, protect your children's self-worth, and never let anyone convince you that you deserve less than equal treatment just to keep the peace. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept crumbs when your children deserve the whole feast. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the people who truly matter.